Good evening, everyone. My name is Melanie McNair, the Senior Director of Public Programming here at the Center for Fiction, the only literary nonprofit that supports and celebrates the creation and enjoyment of fiction. How many of you are visiting us for the first time this evening? Oh, great. Well, welcome to all of you. We do a lot of things here, so sign up for our mailing list and follow us on social media so you can learn more about us. I'm not going to belabor that too much because I'm so excited about tonight. A couple of housekeeping announcements. We will have an audience Q&A, and if you're here, please raise your hand if you have a question, and one of our interns will bring a microphone to you so that the audience who's watching online can hear your question as well. And if you're watching online, hello, you can type your question into the chat at any time. When the event is over, you can purchase the books in the bookstore by going out the back door and then coming back in here to line up to get your books personalized. Victor was kind enough to pre-sign them, but he'd be happy to personalize. All right, tonight is a storyteller event, which means that we will have a reading from the novel and then a discussion, and I'm thrilled to introduce our guest. Of course, the man of the hour is Victor Lavalle, is the author of 7 works of fiction, 4 novels, 2 novellas, and a collection of short stories. His novels have been included in the Best of the Year list by the New York Times, Book Review, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, The Nation, and Publishers Weekly, among others. He's been the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, an American Book Award, the Shirley Jackson Award, and the Key to Southeast Queens. He lives in the Bronx with his wife and kids and teaches at Columbia University. And for our reading tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Crystal Joy Brown. She's a multi-talented Broadway favorite film and television actress. She most recently worked on Merrily We Roll Along at New York Theater Workshop as Gussie, along with Jonathan Groff, Lindsay Mendez, and Daniel Radcliffe, and that is transferring to Broadway in September, and I already have my tickets, and I hope you get yours. She has multiple recurring guest star roles on such shows as Power Book 3, Raising Kanan, and The Equalizer with Queen Latifah. Her recent film work includes Girlfriendship, Writing Around the Christmas Tree, One Royal Holiday, and Disney Plus's Magic Camp. With 5 Broadway shows under her belt, including Eliza and Hamilton and Diana Ross in Motown. Her extensive theatrical background has led her to be a 2-time Fred Astaire Award nominee and work closely with some of the world's top Oscar, Olivier, and Tony Award-winning playwrights and creative teams. She is also an avid activist in mental health, wellness, and social justice. During her time with Hamilton, she helped create Ham for Progress, to use the brand and many talents of the company to push for change in our society and create a more equitable future. Please welcome her to the stage.
There are 2 kinds of people in this world: those who live with shame and those who die from it. On Tuesday, Adelaide Henry would have called herself the former, but by Wednesday, she wasn't as sure. If she was trying to live, then why would she be walking through her family's farmhouse carrying an Atlas jar of gasoline, pouring that gasoline on the kitchen floor, the dining room table, dousing the satay in the den? And after she emptied the first Atlas jar, why go back to the kitchen for another jar, for the other jar, then climb the stairs to the second floor, listening to the splash of gasoline on every step? Was she planning to live or trying to die? There were 27 Black farming families in California at Lucerne Valley in 1915. Adelaide and her parents had been one of them. After today, there would only be 26. Adelaide reached the second floor landing. She hardly smelled the gasoline anymore. Her hands were covered in fresh wounds, but she felt no pain. There were 2 bedrooms on the second floor, her bedroom and her parents'. Adelaide's parents were lured west by the promise of the land in the valley. the federal government encouraged Americans to homestead California. The native population had been decimated, cleared off the property. Now, it was time to give it all away. This invitation was one of the few that the United States extended to even the Negro citizens. And after 1866, the African Society put out a call to colonize Southern California. The Henrys were among the hundreds who came. They weren't going to get a fair shot in Arkansas, that's for damn sure. The federal government called this homesteading. Glenville and Eleanor Henry fled to California and grew alfalfa and wild grass, sold it to cattle owners for feed. Glenville studied the work of Luther Burbank, and in 1908, they began growing the botanist's Santa Rosa plums. To Adelaide, the fruit tasted of sugar and self-determination. Adelaide had worked the orchards and fields along her daddy since she was 12, labored in the kitchen and the barn with her mother for even longer. 31 years of life on this farm. 31. And now, she would burn it all down. Ma'am? Adelaide startled at the sound of the wagon man. Good Lord, what is that smell? He stood at the front entrance, separated from the interior by a screen door and nothing more. Adelaide stood upstairs at the threshold of her parents' bedroom. The half-full Atlas jar wobbled in her grip. She turned and called over the landing, Mr. Cole, I will be out in 5 minutes. She couldn't see him, but she heard him, the grumble of an old black man, barely audible, but somehow still as loud as a thunderclap. It reminded her of her father. That's what you said 5 minutes ago. Adelaide heard the creak of the screen door's springs. A vision flashed before her. Mr. Cole coming to the foot of the stairs, and Adelaide dumping the remaining gasoline right onto his head. Adelaide reaching for the matches that were in her pocket, lighting one and dropping it right onto Mr. Cole. Then combustion. But she didn't want to kill this old man, so she called out to him. Have you got my trunk into the wagon yet? She called. Quiet, quiet. Then the sigh of the screen door being released. He hadn't stepped inside. He called for her again from the porch. I tried, he said, but that thing weighs more than my damn horse. What did you pack inside? My whole life, she thought. Everything that still matters. She looked to the door of her parents' bedroom, then called down one more time. 5 minutes, Mr. Cole. We'll get the trunk in the wagon together. Another grumble, but he didn't curse her, and she didn't hear the sound of his wagon's wheels riding off. For a man like Mr. Cole, that was as close to an okay as she was going to get. Would she really have set him on fire? She couldn't say. But it's startling what people will do when they are desperate. Adelaide Henry turned the handle of her parents' bedroom and stepped inside and shut the door behind her and stood in silence and in the dark. The heavy curtains were pulled shut. She'd done that at dawn, after she'd dragged the bodies of Glenville and Eleanor inside and put them to bed. They lay together now in their marriage bed, the same place where Adelaide had been conceived. They were only shapes, because she'd thrown a sheet over their corpses. Their blood had soaked through. The outline of their bodies appeared as red silhouettes. She went to her father's side. The fabric had adhered to his skin when the blood dried. She'd pulled the sheet up over his head. Better that way. She didn't want to see what remained of him. She poured gasoline over his corpse, from his forehead to his feet. Now Adelaide moved around to her mother's side. She'd pulled Eleanor's side of the sheets up only to her chin, hiding the damage done to her throat. She hadn't been able to pull the shroud over her mother entirely. Strange to get squeamish about that part, considering all the other damage done to Eleanor's body. Adelaide tilted the jar above her mother's head, but found she couldn't pour out the last of the fuel. She held it over Eleanor and stared into her mother's opened, emptied eyes. She couldn't bring herself to do it. She set the jar down and crouched by the bed. She whispered into Eleanor's dead ear. "You kept too many secrets," Adelaide said. "Look what it cost you." With that, she rose and reached into her pocket. The matchbox bore the symbol of the African society, a silhouette of a black man driving a plow. She struck a match and watched it burn. She flung it at the bed, where it landed on her father. She turned quickly so she wouldn't have to see the body's catch, but she heard it, as if the whole room took a single deep breath. An instant later, she felt heat across her scalp and neck, but when she stepped out of the room, the flames still licked at her skin. She realized it hadn't been the fire that burned at her, but the guilt. On the upstairs landing, her right knee buckled, and she nearly went down, kneeling with one hand on the railing. She'd done it. Behind that door, her parents were burning. Maybe she would stay with them. That's what she considered. Enough gasoline had spilled on her hands, her dress, that it wouldn't take long for her to burn. Step back inside the bedroom and kneel at the foot of their bed and be engulfed in the family line. That's what she deserved. What kind of daughter would do the things she's done in the last 24 hours? A foul and terrible daughter. Soon, Adelaide rose to her feet, but hardly recognized she'd done it, as if her body wanted her to survive, even if her soul felt differently. She rose and put one foot forward, then the next. She'd be leaving, it seemed. Who decided that? She wondered, even as she held the railing and descended the stairs. "Well, there you are," Mr. Cole said when he stepped out from the screen door. He looked from her to the house. Did he see smoke yet? Could he hear the upstairs bedroom walls starting to crackle? His buckboard wagon sat on the porch, horse nearly as malnourished as the man. Adelaide stood 6 inches taller than Mr. Cole and outweighed him by 40 pounds. No wonder he couldn't lift the truck. There were handles on either side of the seaward steamer trunk. Adelaide grabbed one end and Mr. Cole took the other. She bent her legs and lifted. Mr. Cole huffed with a strain. "Quick now," he said. Though he wasn't doing much work, he still felt happy to give commands. He yanked the trunk towards the bed of the wagon, and Mr. Cole was pulled along. They reached the wagon, and with one last effort, they set it down in the bed. The wagon sank inches, and all 4 wooden wheels creaked. Mr. Cole's horse took a step forward, as if trying to flee the burden. When they stood straight, both Mr. Cole and Adelaide were breathless. Adelaide climbed into the wagon. The only other item she brought, besides that trunk, was her travel bag. It had been packed already, sitting right at the threshold inside the house. Mr. Cole got in beside her on the spring seat. He looked back at the house. "Where's your people?" he asked. "My parents," she said softly. "They don't come out to see you off?" She looked at the house as well. The bedrooms lay at the back of the structure. Even if there was smoke, it probably wouldn't be seen from the front of the house for a little while. Maybe she had a bit more time before the fire becomes obvious. "They're resting," she said. Mr. Cole kept any further questions to himself. He held the reins and gave 2 clicks of his tongue, and his poor horse pulled and pulled until finally the wagon moved. Adelaide was leaving California with $154, a large sum of money, and still hardly enough for an entirely new life. But that was all she had. That, and a travel bag, and her trunk. The farmhouse would burn. Eventually, their neighbors, the closest farm lay nearly a mile away, would notice. They would sift through the damage and find only 2 bodies inside. They would ask where Glenville and Eleanor's daughter had gone. On Tuesday, Adelaide Henry had been a farmer. By Wednesday, she became a fugitive. Thank you. Thank you. All right. A few stumbles, but we got it. Thank you. My absolute pleasure. Get out of here. Oh, God. Now what happens?
Round of applause for Crystal, please.
Thanks.
So I thank you all. Can you all hear me all right? Yes? Okay. So I thank you all for coming, and I was trying to figure out what would be the best way to make this night interesting for all of you, particularly since you were not going to have to suffer through me reading, and you could instead enjoy Crystal's reading. Then I thought what we could do is I could just walk you through the sort of work that went into this book, how it came to be. And to that end, I spent this morning learning how to do PowerPoint.
Is that okay?
25 years after
like,
everybody
there are a few
knows how to
moments
do
where
that.
it's like, what am I saying?
And put together these slides, and I essentially figured I'm going to just walk you through all the things that went into this book, Chris, all the things that went into this book, and all the things that I sort of learned along the way, yeah? First, next slide. I'm going to just be saying next slide because we didn't come up with a signal for me to do that. So that's my book, the first slide, yes? So that's how I figured that's the energy that we're bringing to today, yes? And I was super excited. Actually, let's go back one if we could. The amazing thing about this, number one, I just love this cover. I just think it's amazing. And then if we say like one of the other touches that I think was almost like the last minute thing, but I think you'll appreciate it when you see the hardcover, is like this is what the cover looked like before they added in just a tint of blue to the sky to suggest that there's some level of hope or optimism in this world. And when you look at it on the book itself, it is really remarkable. It just was a moment of me enjoying what a great designer can sort of pull off with just little touches. But either way, that's the cover of this. That's the amazing cover of my book. And now, please, next slide. Thank you. All right. So how did this book come to be? It began with this book. So I would tell a little story about how I came across this book. So sometimes I get invited to go do talks at different universities or go to bookstores in various places. And one of the things that I've learned over time is that if I go to a place where I think I probably will not come back again, I like to buy a book of local history. So, because oftentimes for these readings, you're there for like, you fly in one day, you spend the day with students, and then you do a reading, and then the next day you go home. So you don't actually see the place you go to. And so I always feel like if I pick up a book, that'll be my way of understanding where I was, right? So I went to the University of Montana, their bookstore, and I was in their local history section, and I was just parsing through the various books, and I came across this one, Montana Women Homesteaders, A Field of One's Own, edited by Dr. Sarah Carter. And my first reaction when I saw this was I didn't know there were women homesteaders. By that, I don't mean I didn't know that there were women there, but the way I understood them was sort of Little House on the Prairie style, right? Like there was a man who was leading the charge in every way, and then he was married and he had some daughters, right? And his wife and daughters did whatever they did, right? In some secondary way. But the whole point of this book was this was about women who went out to Montana alone, right? They called them lone women, thus the title. And the idea was single women and widows could go out to this part of the country and could claim land without anybody co-signing for them, which is a real kind of revelation for the time period. And maybe even to like pull it back and explain a little bit, as was sort of said, discussed a little bit in the reading that Crystal did. Essentially, the United States had either slaughtered or kicked off all the indigenous folks who were there, right, and pushed them onto reservations and all the rest. And they were in a real hurry to get this land civilized, cultivated, whatever it might be. And they were in such a rush to do it that they relaxed the rules for who would be allowed to do it, right? Relaxed them in ways that were incredibly surprising to me and was sort of why I got so drawn into the book. Number one, as I said, if you were a single woman or a widow, you could come out and claim land under your name and own it personally, right? You couldn't do it if you were a married woman. If you were a married woman, you were stuck with the dude you married, right? But if you were on your own, you couldn't. And as a side note, this is a very small thing, but usually the United States takes quite a second place to Canada for many, many rights. But in this period of time, Canada did not allow single women to do this. So suck it, Canada. It's the one time we win compared to Canada about any rights. So that I found that super interesting as well. Yeah. So they relaxed the rules about gender, but they also relaxed the rules about race in ways that were incredibly surprising to me. And from there, I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit, but from there, I sort of dove into even more books to sort of learn more and more about this place. I thought this was just going to be an interesting book about the place I was, but in fact, it turned into this book about history I never knew. Next slide, please. And so here's some of the books. I took a picture. My wife suggested I take a picture today just to make clear, like, just even a small number of the books that were there. These are the ones that were in my house that are overdue. You can see overdue at the Columbia Library. I've been retaking them out every 6 months for a while. But Vigilante Woman, African Americans on the Western Frontier, Letters of a Woman Homesteader, The Montana Frontier, African American Women Confront the West from 1600 to 2000. And then that last book was in some ways the most helpful, A Gathering of Memories. It's a history of the Big Sandy community in particular. And so it's journals, articles, all the rest. And there's a Big Sandy Historical Society. I found them on Facebook. I called them up. There was a really sweet lady who was often not there. But I finally caught her and she said, I'll mail you the book and I'll trust you to send me a check. And I did. And I got, so this was just even a small smattering of the research I started to do. And the more research I did, the more I fell into this world and into this history. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a little fuzzy, but this is Maddie Kramer. She was a newspaper editor from Iowa and New York who moved to Malta, Montana in 1908 with $100 and her son. She became managing editor of a local paper, and because of the things she was writing there, she came to the attention of the Great Northern Railway, who ran the railway all along the northern frontier. And they were so interested in her story and the fact that she was a lone woman who went out there that they asked her to start writing a newsletter that was just talking about what she was going through, what she was doing, how she showed up there. And it became incredibly popular. Tons of women wrote her asking how she did it. Men as well wrote her asking how she did it. But then this was the beginning of another interesting sort of subplot of everything I was getting into, was that the Great Northern Railway paid for her newsletter because then more women would come out and buy train tickets, right? That's the only way they could get there. And so it was the beginning of also, a very American thing of like uplift and fleecing people for money, going together, as old as our nation. And so, but I found Maddie Kramer so interesting because of her history. And in fact, within the book, this is the person whose newsletter she saves, that Adelaide, the main character, saves, and that kind of get her to go, that give her the bravery to go. All right, next slide, please. So Here's who I imagine, and maybe you do too, when you think of homesteaders, quote unquote, hardy white folks. This photo is taken by a woman named Evelyn Cameron, who had her own interesting history. She was a British woman from a very wealthy family. On the day she married, she and her husband left the family in England and traveled out west. And they were just in love with the history, the mystery, and the adventure of it all. And they wanted to go out there and make their way. And they came to the U.S., came to Montana in particular, and then they failed miserably. Right? At one job after another, they couldn't get it right until Evelyn started taking photos. And Evelyn, because she was a local, because people knew her, she'd been there for years, she gained a degree of trust that many, many others couldn't. And as a result, she got people to sit for her in ways that they wouldn't for others. As a secondary story that's also super interesting is that Evelyn Cameron's photos were only discovered, I think it was in the 70s, the 1970s, because, so she took all her photos, she made a living off it, and it was the best living she and her husband could make. So she did well, relatively speaking, for herself. But after she died, it was just a whole bunch of these glassine, photos just bequeathed to a friend and left in a basement. This one academic essentially found the woman who got the material from her and had to spend a long time just convincing her to let her use Evelyn's photos. And then finally, when she got them, they were like a revelation, the kind of things that Evelyn was able to capture. And if you're at all interested, I think in the 90s, maybe it was Knopf, someone else, published a book of her photos, and then it was reissued maybe 10 years later by a smaller press. But they're really interesting photos. In particular here, there's Mary Whaley, the woman in the white apron and cowboy hat, and Cap Barker, the woman with her arm on Mary's shoulder. Those are only two people who were named, but nonetheless, like when I thought of like, okay, homesteaders, if I'm gonna say it's not just these white dudes, the Little House on the Prairie people, then who is it? And I say, it was these Little House on the Prairie people, I guess. But I mean, or is this tougher stock, right? Because they do look hardcore, right? And they are all coming out there to do this profound and brave thing. So Evelyn was the photographer who took these. Next slide, please. And that's Evelyn standing on a horse. I just thought it was so interesting that she staged that photo, and that she looks quite happy. Yeah. Why she's standing on a horse, I don't know, but it certainly is a captivating shot. So that's the photographer herself. But of course, these homesteaders were not the first people here. Next slide, please. This is Rocky Boy, who was the leader of the Ojibwe people, otherwise known as the Chippewa Cree people, in that region of Montana at the time. He became known as Rocky Boy because of a very poor translation by whoever he was dealing with. In his language, his name was Stone Child, and they translated that for whatever reason to Rocky Boy. Yeah. And he was like a fierce advocate for his people, but inevitably what was happening while they were there was that the land that they were allowed to live on was shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And in fact, the Rocky Boy Reservation exists to this day in Montana. Next slide. And this was a photo taken in 2021 because I think one of the things that's worth saying is the Ojibwe were there before the settlers, but more importantly, they're still there. Yeah, and that certainly in narratives, particularly about indigenous folks, is that the story is all about how they were decimated and they're no longer there, and that erases all the people who are. Yeah, and so here, I like this photo, number one, because it's recent. It takes place on the Rocky Boy Reservation. They are celebrating 11 buffaloes having been essentially reintroduced to the landscape. Because the buffalo had largely been, decimated also over 100 years ago, and I just like this for the reminder within all this that no people are ever truly erased, or certainly these people certainly were not truly erased, but And they were the ones who were there, who preceded everyone who we're talking about. And that everyone who we're talking about, whether we're talking about them as villains or heroes or heroines, this is whose land they're on, yeah? And even the best stories of like, I'm so proud of so-and-so, you still have to put it into context, yeah? With the folks who were there before. All right, next slide, please. So digging into these questions of who folks were and who was there and all this stuff, the more I got into it, led me to this woman, Annie Morgan. Born into slavery on a Baltimore plantation in 1833, she had expertise with herbs and natural medicines and served in a medical capacity under General George Custer. After his death, she traveled with the Buffalo Soldiers out to Fort Benton and served there as a nurse. She took care of humans and animals. But she settled down to take care of a wealthy man's dying relative, and part of her compensation was a cabin. Once she got that cabin for her work, she applied for a homestead grant on that land, and at that period, you had to work on it for 5 years. A little bit later, they shortened it to 3 years because 5 years was killing people, right? So after 5 years, she proved up, owning that land and the cabin outright. And in 1880, she was the only black woman homesteader in the county. At some point, she met, I think this is him, but can't say for sure. She met a man who was delirious with typhoid, lying in a river on her property, and she nursed him back to health. His name was Joseph Fisher Jack Case, and they lived together in that cabin for 30 years. They couldn't marry, of course, because the laws of the period would not let them marry, but they were common law married for that 30 years. Next slide, please. And this is their cabin, the Morgan Case Homestead. It is listed in the National Register of Historic Places and preserved by the Forest Department, and you can stay there for short periods of time by lottery. You have to do it by lottery, and it's very, very basic, but it is kind of amazing that you can stay in that cabin. Yes, so I would encourage you to look up there. If that sounds at all interesting to you, to look up their lottery system, because it's pretty amazing that you can still go and that they've held on to it in this way. So Annie Morgan, I loved her as an inspiration, but in some ways I don't know why I was being so literal. It felt like she was too early in time for me to use her as a model for any of the women in my story. I don't know why. It's silly, but that was how I was thinking. And I came across another woman named Bertie Brown, right, who was famous in Montana for making the best homebrew or moonshine in all of Montana. Truly so famous that people came from all over, from Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, for her homebrew. And so then I was like, okay, that's super interesting. And she ran a tavern out of her home, right? So I found that super fascinating. But one of the things that you don't have with Bertie Brown is like photos, and I don't know why, but it's very hard sometimes for me to understand a human being without seeing someone that I can kind of feel like is tangible. Next slide, please. So for inspiration, I went to some other black woman homesteaders of the time. Lucretia Marshbanks on the left was a hotel owner and ranch owner who settled in Black Hills, South Dakota. And if you ever watched the show Deadwood, she was the inspiration for Aunt Lou. All right. And then on the right is Harriet Branham Johnson O'Kelly, long name. She proved up in Guthrie, Oklahoma after the death of her husband. She tended to the land and raised their 4 kids all on her own. And so I started collecting these kind of stories about black women homesteaders in particular who were there. And the thing that was a marvel to me was like, before I read that book and before I got into this world, I would have said there were no black women homesteaders. And then after Annie Morgan, I would have said, okay, there was 1. And then suddenly there was 3. And then there was Bertie, who I couldn't find a picture of, but she existed. And it was, for me, this sort of like building revelation about the sort of, on some level, the underlying sort of thesis of the whole book, if it had a thesis, which is that the past is much more complicated than I have been taught to understand. And my feeling had been, if it seems that complicated to me, maybe other people will also find it complicated in an interesting way and illuminating in an interesting way. And of course, I also took the risk. I felt like maybe everyone would be like, we all know about black women homesteaders. It's the oldest thing in the world, and we've read about it for years. And then I would feel like an idiot, and I wouldn't publish the book. But every time I talked about, people would go, really? And I said, I gotcha. All right. So next slide, please. Now, the one thing we do have is Bertie Brown's actual cabin near Grass Range, Montana. This is the cabin. It has not been given the same treatment as the Annie Morgan home, but I share this only because it's the truth, but I didn't put it in the book. The other reason it looks like this is so Bertie sold that homebrew, but the other thing she did to make money was that she took in laundry, and she cleaned laundry. And at the time, the latest advancement in how you clean laundry is you wash it in gasoline. And that was better than the older ways that were even more toxic fumes. And so she washed some laundry, she had it up to dry. So that's her house. That's all I want. I don't want to go into too much because I love Bertie too much to talk about the rest of it. But the cabin did not survive in any real good way. But it is still there. And so I still feel like that's a beautiful and powerful thing, right? All right, but we talked about the indigenous folks who were there, the white folks who were there, the black folks who were there. But what about, next slide, please, the Chinese population in Montana at the time? The Chinese first came to Montana in the 1860s, following the large gold discoveries at Bannock and Virginia City. You know it as the Gold Rush. By 1870, the Chinese accounted for 1 out of every 10 residents in the Montana Territory, 10% of the population. But the Chinese Exclusion Act, designed specifically to curtail any and all increase in the Chinese population, and also if anyone of Chinese descent left, say, to visit home, once this passed, they couldn't come back. So even if they had been here and set up a life, they couldn't return. And that shrunk the numbers substantially. In 1870, just to give you a sense of it, in 1870, there were only about 18,000 white people living in Montana and 2,000 Chinese people. That's how big a population it was. But by 1915, the time of my novel, their numbers had already shrunk to about 1,000. And by the 1950s, there were almost none. Right? And so what was the reason for this? Did they just say, Montana's not for me? No. Next slide, please. This is just one example of the kind of propaganda that was going around. Do you actually know under what conditions your laundry is done? In the corner up there, there's a drawing of a Chinese man spitting on clothes, the suggestion that that's how they clean their clothes. And it's a long list of things essentially saying, don't go to those Chinese people, come to good old American Dothan steam laundry. So say it with me, fuck Dothan steam laundry. Yes? But the real point of all this is that part of what was going on, of course, as is always the case, is that the Chinese were doing well. They were creating businesses. They were raising families. They were creating a middle class. And that could not be allowed to stay, yes? And so a law had to be created to create, for the first time ever, the idea of illegal immigrants in the United States. There were no illegal immigrants before this because there was no law saying there were legal immigrants before this. But also, importantly, is the narrative for this kind of laundry was also not openly like, we hate the Chinese, screw them. Well, this one was. But a lot of them, it wasn't that. It was instead, so there were, in particular, some of the research I was going into, let's say, for instance, in Butte or Havre, one of the cities, there would be a woman whose husband died, a white woman whose husband died. And she's got to find a way to make a living now that her husband's dead. And so to make a living, she starts to take in laundry. And then the narrative begins like, hey, look, we loved the Chinese folks who did the laundry, but she needs people to support her. And she's a real American. She lost her husband. And I mean, they were great, but let's take care of Mrs. Haversham. Yeah. And that was often the narrative about how or why any and all these kinds of prejudices sort of reared their heads, right? Like one of the things that was so interesting to me was that like even my idea of when I say like there's black folks there, there's Chinese folks there, there's Japanese folks there, there's Mexican folks there, and then you add in there's there's gay and lesbian, in particular since I'm talking about the women, there's lesbian couples there that are surreptitiously living together and all this kind of stuff. I thought that the way that this would all unfold would be in the much more cinematic pitchforks, fire, burn everyone down, kill everything, that kind of thing. But it wasn't the way it worked. Instead, the way it worked was with growing public concern about change, right? And that's always the way that you can sort of like instill a great degree of terror in people, is to say the world is changing and you're going to be left out. And maybe that sounds familiar. That's all. That's at least a small sampling of some of the people who were there, many of whom I never would have guessed would be there in that time and place. But then I had to pick a place for this story to take. It's bad repetition. Place for the story to take place. I'm sorry. Next slide, please. And that I picked Big Sandy, Montana, and I picked Big Sandy, Montana because over 15 years ago, I think, or more, I was a visiting professor at Mills College in Oakland. And while I was there, I made enough money, I bought my first car. Yeah. And it was a wonderful car, but its air conditioning didn't really work. And so when the job ended after 2 years, I said, I got to drive this car all the way back to New York. I could, as the start of the summer, I could either drive through the south or I could drive along the north. And so I picked along the north. And that's how I got to know Montana for the first time. I visited Glacier National Park. I went to Crater Lake. And at some point, I believe I passed Big Sandy, Montana, though I never stayed there. It just had the best name of all the names. Because so many of the names there, one of the things that was also interesting was so many of the towns there had names like Athens or like all these big, ambitious names. And the name Big Sandy, they don't know exactly where the name came from, but supposedly it came from a guy named Big Sandy Lane, who was a freight wagon driver who got his wagon stuck in a creek nearby. And I just loved how sort of low rent that was as a reason for your town's name. And so I decided on Big Sandy. And then the other thing, the other reason so I picked Big Sandy, and then I was doing all this research, and for a second I thought, like, maybe I should change the name, because by the end of the story, you don't have the best opinion of everyone in Big Sandy, so maybe that will be insulting or whatever. But something weird happened, like a previous book of mine I did called Big Machine, took place in Oakland, California, but I changed the name of the city to Garland, California, and one of the wildest things to me was I would occasionally hear from folks from Oakland who would say, why didn't you just name it Oakland? I wished you had blown up Oakland, not Garland. Like I thought people would be hurt or insulted, but in fact, they loved it. And so I said, here, maybe the people of Big Sandy will love what we do to them. And if they don't, I'm not going back. So, okay. So the next slide, please. I just thought this would be interesting. Big Sandy then, Big Sandy now. You can see it is still largely the same level of town, yeah? As of 2020 in the census, it had a population of 605. At the time that I'm writing about, it had a population of about 500. So it has grown, yeah? So, all right. One more thing, just sort of this surprising thing that I would find a lot, just like I talked about, a lot of the towns were given these sort of big famous city names as a way to suggest their ambition. Next slide, please. The other thing that I found again and again were opera houses throughout Montana, in the cities, but also in the small towns. And really, in the end, all they were was the local theater. But they didn't call it the theater, they called it the opera house, right? And so in a place like Bozeman, you had this genuinely grand structure where you could do, opera, like a big opera. But next slide, please. Here you have the Ming Opera House, which is mentioned in the book. And then there you have the Fromberg Opera House, right? And I don't even mean that comparison as a way to laugh at Fromberg, right? that I'm imagining that is a great space for Fromberg. Yeah, and that people, but the idea that like in this space where people are going, they're fighting incredibly harsh elements, all the rest, that there was some impulse in them to sort of, I think the kind way to say it would be to elevate themselves with the idea of opera, and the less kind way to say it would be to put on airs, right? And to sort of not be in the place they were and hold on, because it was all about holding on to like the Eastern seaboard sort of culture, or even more, the European culture that many of them had left behind. But I just found it fascinating that there were opera houses everywhere. Next, please. This is just a small thing, but this was the soundtrack of the book. I played this every day for years while I was writing the book. It's an amazing, amazing novel, if you've never heard it. I think we were playing a little bit earlier when people came in. For whatever reason, I just thought it would be interesting to share with you all that's the soundtrack. And then our very last slide is the trunk. Because I knew, as much as all this history was fascinating to me, and I hoped fascinating to other people, you still needed a reason for people to turn the pages. And for me, that turned into the idea of the mystery box, right? And that idea of, what's his name again? The director who does the mystery boxes. He did Lost, he did Super 8. J.J. Abrams, thank you. And I thought, like, what if I had a mystery box and then there was actually something in it? There was actually an answer in the mystery box, and that would be exciting. And so, and my wife and I, we had a trunk like this in the house for a long while. It was a place for storage, but it was also a supreme pain in the ass to move. And I just thought, like, yeah, this is tactile and heavy and all the rest. And so, if you haven't read the book yet, there's something in the trunk. And if you have read the book, you know what's in the trunk. And with that, I will say thank you so much for listening to me. I do appreciate it. And if there are any questions, I am happy to answer them. And if not, I'm happy to just sign some books or say hello to people.
If you have any questions, you can raise your hand and we'll come over to you with a microphone.
Yes, do you have a question? The process, yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about proving up what that means, what the process was?
Yes, I will, Donna. So the idea of proving up, like I said, like you show up on the territory, and you sign your name, and you get that place. So originally it was 5 years, but really 3 years, and you have to live on that land. It's kind of interesting. Like you live on that land for 5 months out of each year, because even the government understood like it is death to be out here all the time. So we're not going to ask you to be here all the time, which is kind of a cheat, but whatever, that's how it goes. So you have to be on the land for 3 consecutive years, 5 months or so out of every year. And each year you had to cultivate a certain portion of land, right? And as long as you were doing that, and that was inspected by the claim inspectors, as long as you did that each year and you continue to cultivate that land, after the 3rd year, the land was given to you free and clear. And then it was yours forever. So that's the process, and they called that process, once you actually completed the 3 years, got your name in the paper listing you as having proved up, that meant it's yours forever. You're welcome, kind of thing. But this is a side thing that, like, I don't know what people feel about this, but one of the things that I always find confusing about the narrative about the West, particularly, say, the modern day narrative about some folks in the West, about, like, get the government out of here, this is our land, you can't have it, and all this sort of stuff. I always feel like the mistake the government made is like parents who don't teach their kids to say thank you, right? Like, it's true you worked hard to get this, and we still gave it to you. And you should say thank you. And I'm not saying you should bow down to us, but I'm regularly flabbergasted by the idea that people got something for free, and then have the audacity 50 years later, 100 years later, to say, you didn't do anything for me. I'll be like, your great-grandparents bought you a house. Anyway, that's a side thing, but I just, regularly as I was reading this, I just couldn't believe, I just felt like every year the federal government, after you prove up, there should have just been a letter that just said, "You're welcome." The federal government, and you just get it no matter what, and that just instills in there like, I worked for this, but also this is pretty good. This is quite a gift. Anyway, so that's the second half of my proving up thing.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Could you talk a little bit about, like, as a writer, and this being sort of historical fiction, right? How much detail do you need
Right.
to know, to feel like you can capture the world? As a fiction writer, obviously you have creative license.
Yeah.
Right? But I think as a writer, even if you don't put it in the book, like, there's things you just kind of need to know. And I'm just sort of curious, like, in your process.
Yeah.
I saw the stack of books. You read a lot.
Yes.
But how much do you need to know?
I know it's a cliche, but I feel like it's iceberg-ish analogy, right? Like the thing I really personally can't stand in, if the historical fiction that is, you just see how much research the writer did, is exhausting to me. I know other people, that's the whole reason they're there. They want all of that. But for me, I always feel like I should feel like I'm living the life the way these folks lived it then, and that it's likely they didn't spend 4 pages worth thinking about the way they tied up their this and the, because I don't. When I put on my shoes, I don't think, and then he tied the shoe this way, and it was a knot of this or whatever, So I always feel like it should feel like I'm living with the characters and trying on some level to think like they would in the world. But the thing that's fascinating, of course, is figuring out what is the thing that sounds like them versus what do I think is the thing, because I've watched Deadwood or I've watched all these shows and they have taught me a version of the West that is not the West. It is David Milch or whoever, and it's a minor thing, but one of the things that was so interesting to me and gave me such an insight came later in the story was in that big book, the Big Sandy history book. I came across this one little passage by this woman, like a page where she's just talking about daily life and stuff. And she said in passing this thing of, you would never in your life call anyone by their first name if they weren't family. And even then, you wouldn't call them by their first name outside the house. And it was fascinating to me. And then I realized I had to go back because I had like Adelaide and this woman Grace. They start to call each other Adelaide and Grace and Bertie and Fiona, like all these names. And I said, oh, right, because you can't presume that level of familiarity. And then the idea that even in public, you wouldn't say a family member's first name to them was mind-blowing, And so I got to go back in and I saw, like, once I switched that up, there was this way that felt like the formality of an earlier time in a way that felt slightly uncomfortable, because that, like, 100 pages in, it's just like, can somebody just say Fiona? Can somebody say Bertie? And I realized that, but they won't. They wouldn't. And I thought, like, okay, that's the kind of lived in history that I want to do, as opposed to here's every detail of their clothes, And so for me, that was the thing. But of course, I think some people would say, like, my people don't sound old-timey enough. But then I read their letters, and in their letters, they're not saying, like, I went down to the hitching post, and they're not saying that. They're just saying, I very much enjoyed meeting you. I go, like, okay. That's pretty close,
Time for one more question.
I think there's one here.
My question's kind of related to hers, but that was interesting. Research as an unlearning is
Yes.
a very interesting concept, and personally as well as for work. But just curious about you showed us the stack of books, so that was time. So just curious about your process in terms of research, and are you doing it side by side? Are you like, I have to read, for blank number, what was the process for this book in terms of time?
In time.
And in terms of balancing the writing and the research?
The first version of this book was actually a story. There was an anthology called Long Hidden, and it was like speculative historical fiction. It was a wonderful anthology, tons of great stuff in there. And I had just read that first book, the Montana Women Homesteaders book, and was into it that much and just wrote this story, maybe 30, 40 pages, and kind of came up to what would now be like the end of the first act, the first third of the book. And I put it down. So that would have been like, I don't know, maybe 2014 or so. So I read that year, I wrote that story, then I was done. And then 2018, after I published a novel called The Changeling, I was kind of sick of New York. It's a very New York book. I felt like I'd done everything I could do in New York. And I said, I would love to do something so totally different. And I said, I remember that Montana story. And then as a second note, I had a really good, one person who'd read it had said this really good biting thing to me. At the end of the story, she basically said, like, it's a happy ending for one of the characters, but the other character, I don't actually think it's a happy, I don't think you think it's a happy ending, but that's because you're not thinking about it enough. And I was like, as soon as they said it, I thought about it and I said, oh, they're right. It's true. Like, I sort of essentially just echoed a bad system. But somehow I said, like, oh, but if it's Adelaide, a black woman perpetuating the bad system, it's a better system. And I had to go, no, that's wrong. That can't be right. And so then the other thing that brought me back was saying, how could you take it beyond that step, right? Not like absolve Adelaide of anything, but see, well, what's the step after that? And how does one make right even when one participates in maybe bad things? And then I just started reading. But I had that 40 pages, and in a way that was like a jump start. And I tore it apart, like the book doesn't read like that exactly anymore, but I had a few things in there, and then I was just reading, and it was more like when I learned some new stuff, I would say, oh, I could put that into the book. Oh, the opera houses, they could be at the opera house. And then the process was about 4 years of writing the book, but I was reading really up until we were doing the copy edits. Not the copy edits, the edit rounds. And like that's when the whole don't use first names thing came in. So it was like really up to the line. Yeah. Well, I think that's the last question. Yeah, so thank you all very, very much. I really appreciate you coming.
That was so awesome. And I have to say, I read the book, so you're going to want to do that, and you're going to clear your calendar because you're not going to be able to put it down. But first, you need to go buy it. So go on out those back doors, and then once you get it, come back in here, and you can line up to get it personalized. Thank you all for coming.